Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to the 2020 Contemplation by Design Summit session titled Deliberative Democracy, Social Learning, and Conscious Conversation for Wise Foreign Policy. I am honored to be able to introduce the leading scholars of democracy, Stanford professors Larry Diamond and Francis Fukuyama, and the foreign affairs editor Gideon Rose. The three of them will discuss how to facilitate effective collective action at home and abroad through mature introspection, self-aware public discourse, and social learning. Diamond, Fukuyama, and Rose will discuss the power of conscious communication, respectful dialogue, and deliberative democracy as effective ways out of the all too prevalent, polarizing political discourse that preys on fear. Their work offers hope that a contemplative approach can help solve our biggest problems, such as this pandemic, economic strife, racial injustice, and climate change, by developing the capacity to skillfully engage in the complexity of these issues. Their full biographies are posted on the session description. So briefly, I will just orient you to the highlights that Gideon Rose has been editor of Foreign Affairs since 2010, after serving as managing editor of the magazine from 2000 to 2010. Prior to that, Dr. Rose was Deputy Director of Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and from 1994 to 95, he served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. He authored How Wars End and other works. Larry Diamond is a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute, Professor by courtesy of Political Science and Sociology, and former Faculty Director of the Haas Center for Public Service. His recent book, Ill Winds, is something that we're sure he'll draw upon this evening. Francis Fukuyama is a Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies as well, the Mosbacher Director of the FSI Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and the Director of Stanford's Masters in International Policy program. He's also a professor of political science. I invite you all to enter into the Q&A portion of your webinar questions, as the format for this evening will be each of our distinguished speakers will speak on their own for roughly 10 minutes to lay out some framework of their thoughts, and then they will engage in conversation with one another. After that conversation, your questions will be the focus of the remaining time that we have together this evening. In the spirit of contemplation, I invite you all to set aside whatever you were doing before you joined this moment, and to really come into your feet, come into your breath, come into your body, and notice what thoughts and emotions you're experiencing in this moment, and what you seek to gain by being present with these wise guides and teachers, so that you can fully receive what is being offered to you tonight. We will begin with Gideon, and then move to Larry, and then to Frank. Welcome to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tia. Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I am generally a glass half full type guy. And I had a horrible moment this spring. Well, we all had lots of horrible moments, but one in particular came when I was editing an article that Frank was writing for the lead of the summer issue on the pandemic. And it was basically about what was the consequences for world politics and the future going to be of the crisis we were going through. And he made the sort of on the one hand case for thinking why there would be positive outcomes. And then he made the on the other hand case for thinking about why there were possible negative consequences. And I'm thinking, okay, and I know Frank's in a sort of glass half empty kind of mood, but we can balance this out. And then he gets to the conclusion and he kicks off saying, and here is why I am pretty convinced that the glass half empty perspective is the one that's going to come about? And the answer is that the reason for that is that all the positive scenarios depend on a reversal of current trends due to social learning. All the things we're seeing, he wrote, are going in the wrong direction. The indicators are all going down. So the theory of a positive outcome for all this is at some point we'll bottom out. There will be a collective recognition of how far we have fallen and what the obvious way out of our dilemma is. And we will return to some form of rational future policy that for all sorts of areas of things that actually makes life better. And the problem with that scenario is that it depends on our public considering options with real information, making conscious choices about the future, and rationally deciding collectively what is in its long-term enlightened self-interest. Those do not sound like the conditions we are currently in. And if you're looking at this current discourse and thinking you're going to get that learning, you're kind of crazy. And I read that and I basically had to concede that he was 100% correct. And it really threw me, even my gut optimism, because it drove home the point that we're talking about today, which is that all the hypothetical gains liberals talk about, realists don't think there are gains. Realists think the world is a nasty zero-sum place in which all you can do is keep what you have, maybe if you're lucky, from the next guy grabbing it. And if you're a bad guy, you can grab a little more from him. There's no bigger pie. There's no perpetual peace. It's conflict all the way around. Protecting yourself prudently is the best you can do. Liberals think, no, there's potential for cooperation. It's not Hobbes, it's Locke. There are upsides to be gained. But the upsides turn out to require cooperation, active cooperation, and that active cooperation turns out to require some degree of empathy and moral community so that you're not trying to screw all the people you're working with, and some kind of discourse in which you can communicate truthfully and accurately with each other and get a picture of reality so that you can form rational collective action plans for constructive cooperation. And basically, that is what we are now missing. That great political philosopher, Joni Mitchell, commented that don't it always go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Decency and discourse turn out to have been hidden, omitted variables keeping the American political system moving forward. And the loss of them has made the system break down. Some degree of common empathy and fellow feeling, I think, is still there among the public and clearly can be latently mobilized, but it needs to be. That's the decency part. But the discourse part, some kind of rational communication with other players that allow you to consider evidence and make rational decisions, is a precondition, I now realize, for the kind of cooperation that is necessary to exploit the potential gains that liberals go on and on about. The gains don't happen naturally. It is difficult to achieve them. Cooperation is really difficult. Life is full of stag hunts and everybody defects. And there needs to be some pull together and a common discourse. And so I think that's why it may seem weird to talk about deliberative discourse and democracy and pausing to reflect and all the mindfulness things, but the basic aspects of listening, empathy in the sense of recognizing another player and their interests and unique situation, all those being able to hear, being able to harmonize and coordinate interests in a positive some way, all that turns out to be the active mechanism of progress in world politics. It's called diplomacy that leads to constructive outcomes that lead to an ever-expanding zone of peace and security. But it begins with a recognition of the other, an ability to understand that the other might have some legitimate perspective, and an ability to hear and understand and engage that perspective. And only move to conflict when necessary. Discourse is what allows you to separate possible opponents from possible enemies. And without that, you're locked in a sucker mode or a hostile mode. And I'll conclude by saying what we saw the other night encapsulates my point. At the debate, the enemy wasn't policy. The enemy was discourse. Discourse was what was being blocked. And the point was precisely to remove discourse from an electoral equation. We used to talk about democracy and liberal democracy and the things that went along with it and were necessary, rights of free speech, free engagement, that kind of thing. I never fully realized until the present era how true the ancients were, how much things could go so bad so quickly, and how much the commitment of the people, the political culture, the passion for the underlying community, and the willingness to subordinate individual interests to at least the potential for common action was an absolutely necessary part. We always talk about Madison saying, if men were not angels, were angels, you wouldn't need this. But you have to have at least some angel in you, because if men are devils, it turns out no matter what the structures, they don't work. And with that, I'll kick it to Larry.
Thank you, Gideon. It's great to see you. I see Frank all the time, but I don't get to see you very often, and that's my great loss and now our great gain. So I'll pick up in a way where Gideon, I think, really kind of eloquently left off. And first of all, offer a reflection on our depressingly, stressingly polarized plight, politically and socially. And then talk with you about one innovation that I think has some hope of helping us climb our way out of this mud pit of societal and political polarization, enmity, and deadlock and tribalism. Begin by saying that I think part of the problem is that we don't interact with one another across party lines and across other social divisions the way we used to. This isn't happening as often on Capitol Hill as it used to either, but we are increasingly trapped in our own kind of little tribes or cleavage groups. This has been happening residentially in the United States as people increasingly move to areas where there are other people who are like them politically and in terms of their social views. It's happening in terms of our avoiding conversations with people who disagree with us politically because we've lost the art, if I can say so, of mutually respectful dialogue. It's happening certainly intensely on social media by people being increasingly trapped in filter bubbles on their Facebook or other platforms, where they mainly interact with people who not only agree with them, but who agree with them intensely and drive their ever more partisan and intolerant expression of whatever views they have. And it's happening because people increasingly have reference to and even exclusive reference to different sources of information. So there's no common basis of facts or statistics, and increasingly we are not even subjected in any kind of intellectually sustained and challenging way to diverse points of view. I will say, without trying to cozy up or further praise Gideon, but if all Americans would just be able to at least systematically read every couple of months the op-ed length of a few of his articles in his journal, Foreign Affairs, where they get competing perspectives on the issues and are not trapped in a single filter bubble. It might be different on foreign policy, but we're reading selectively, we're choosing facts selectively, we're choosing friends and interlocutors selectively. And if what you're doing is getting your information from cable television news, you know, that's probably the worst of all roads to hell in terms of social polarization. So we is my colleague Jim Fishkin, who runs the Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford, and myself, and our colleague, the longtime public opinion theorist and researcher Norman Bradburn, and our collaborator Alice Sue, and the nonprofit Helena, thought to ourselves, well, what if we could bring a random sample of the American public together and get them to engage in a sustained way on a set of issues over a long weekend, say Thursday afternoon to Sunday? And what if, in advance of them coming together to deliberate on issues like the economy, healthcare, immigration, and of course, crucially for our subject tonight, foreign policy, what if they were given in advance a set of balanced briefing papers, you know, distilled to a point where people who weren't political science PhDs could, you know, digest and grasp the different arguments, and so that they had some common basis of evidence and facts that they would all read before coming together? And what if they came together in a single place over a long weekend and both heard competing expert views on these different issues in plenary sessions, and over a period of 3.5 days, systematically engaged about a dozen of their fellow Americans from diverse places, viewpoints, and social backgrounds on all of these issues in mutually respectful dialogue, careful and deliberative listening, with trained and neutral moderators to ensure that all sides could be heard, that people had to listen to one another and mutually respect their diverse views, that arguments would be based in some kind of evidence, that claims could be subjected to fact-checking, which we did over the course of this event. What if that happened? Would it be any different? What I've described is the method that my colleague in communication, Jim Fishkin, has been developing over the last 2 decades, called deliberative polling. And literally exactly a year ago, we brought a random sample of 523 Americans together in Dallas, Texas for this long weekend, prepared in advance with this balanced set of briefing papers on 5 sets of issues, including the 4 I mentioned. And we then, let them engage with one another over a long weekend and with plenary sessions with the experts. And I just want to tell you what happened at the end of this period of, really probing, deep, sometimes awkward and difficult conversations. First of all, there was very significant change in people's opinions on issues. And I'm going to have to be selective here because my time is getting short. But Republicans in particular changed on immigration. One of the propositions was whether the randomly selected participants would support forcing undocumented immigrants to return to their home countries before applying to live and work in the United States. Support for that went down, particularly among Republicans who favored supporting forcing undocumented immigrants to return home, 79% before deliberation, and that was cut in half to 40% after deliberation. Support for reducing the number of refugees allowed to resettle in the US fell from 66% among Republicans to 34% after deliberation. Now let's come to foreign policy. What about rejoining, or really joining, but resuming negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership? In our entire sample, only 47% favored that before deliberation. That jumped to 74% after deliberation. How about recommit? And by the way, again, with a particularly sharp increase among Republicans who nearly tripled their support for the TPP from about 22 to 62%. What about committing to rejoin the Iran nuclear accord? Support for that went from 51% before deliberation to 67% after. Again, a modest increase among Democrats and a nearly doubling of support from 24 to 45% among Republicans. Support for using, this is my favorite item, diplomacy and financial assistance to support democratic development in the world increased from 60 to 72%. It wasn't only Republicans who changed. Democrats moderated some of their views on the economy. For example, support for a $15 an hour minimum wage declined significantly among Democrats when they started realizing what the price tag on that would be and what the difference in wage structures would be. I want to close by making a couple of points. First of all, there was not only very significant change in people's thinking, in their attitudes on specific policy issues, but there were dramatic reductions in what we call affective polarization. To put it bluntly, the degree to which Democrats hate Republicans and Republicans hate Democrats. And the average score on the thermometer scale of 0 to 100 in terms of how members of each party felt about the other side improved about 10 to 15 points between the beginning and end of the deliberation. And I think the reason is that people interacted with other people that they're not used to interacting. I had, white Southern participants who told me they, never had a sustained conversation with an African American before, and vice versa. And people who told me they'd never met an undocumented immigrant before. Tia, I want to say, I think, and Gideon used it as well, the word empathy is really important. And it's very hard to achieve empathy or manifest empathy if you don't have some interaction with people who are different than you. That leads me to my final point. When we talk about what we found in Dallas, Texas, and people of vastly different experiences and social and economic backgrounds and racial heritages, really in tears as they were leaving Dallas, Texas, and leaving these small groups, the answer we always get is, well, that's great. So you achieved a micro transformation among 523 randomly selected Americans. So what? How do you scale this up? And I'll just say, I think it is possible to scale this up. We've been experimenting with automated moderators in online sessions. And if you can automate a moderator and bring 12 people together to deliberate with some of these techniques online, and you still find change, and some of the early research we've been doing suggests it still works, not as dramatically as in person, but it still works, that's got some promise. And I think if we could take these techniques of rational, empathetic, careful listening among people who don't agree with one another, with reference to some common basis of information, and carefully vetted competing points of view, and embed them in our public schools throughout the United States, I see this as having some promise to help us overcome or preempt some of the worst aspects of tribalism that we're struggling with. And over to Frank.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Actually, yesterday I was reading a news story that the Trump official in charge of withdrawing from the TPP was asked by a journalist, "Why are you withdrawing from this agreement?" And he said, "We don't want to be in any agreement that the Chinese are members of." And the journalist said, "Yeah, but the Chinese aren't members of the TPP." And he kind of hemmed and hawed, and then he changed the subject. So a common base of information is probably important. So I wanted to actually say a couple of things about deliberation and social learning in general, and I'm going to take some odd positions. I'm going to come out a little bit against transparency and in favor of hierarchy. So let's just begin with a general consideration of the conditions under which people can actually deliberate. Now, we've got two words in our language that have very, very positive valences. One of them is transparency, and the other one is privacy. And you'll find very few people that are against transparency or against privacy. But if you think about it for 2 seconds, this can't be a consistent position, because basically what privacy is lack of transparency. And transparency is a lack of privacy, and you can't maximize both of those at the same time. And so people actually hold a rather contradictory position, that they think that more of both of these things is going to be better. And I actually think that we have shifted, from a world in which there's lots of privacy and very little transparency, especially about government and about the way institutions work, into a world in which there's actually probably a little bit too much transparency. And that has actually undermined the possibility of deliberation. Now, I think in general, you want a government that is fundamentally transparent in terms of the inputs into government, the outputs of what government does. You want people to know that. But there's a middle stage in which actually transparency isn't that great a thing. And that's the deliberative phase. When Congress or a congressional committee or an executive agency or people in the White House are actually debating whether they should carry out a particular policy. So why is transparency not such a great thing? Well, when you're deliberating, in order to have a good deliberation, you've got to have several different conditions. You have to be able to be honest, right? And we know plenty of cases where, a member of Congress in private will say, in fact, Mitch McConnell, I was at a private meeting with Mitch McConnell back in the late 80s, and he said, I hate tobacco, it's a nasty habit, but I have to support it because, I'm from Kentucky. And, so if you do this in a closed session, you can actually say what you really believe about things. Taking risks is important. Sometimes you have to try out an experimental position. You don't know whether you fully support it, but until you've discussed it, you're not going to know whether that's something that is going to fly or not. And finally, you have to be able to make deals. In a diverse democracy, people are going to disagree, and actually, in order to get anything done, you have to be able to, in some way, shield the kinds of compromises that you make with positions that your side likes in order to produce outputs. And I think that we see plenty of evidence that there's too much transparency in the deliberative process in our political institutions. A lot of people in Congress, particularly in the Senate, so the Senate's supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body, but they would actually, so the C-SPAN began covering the Senate in 1986, and a lot of senators would argue that the decline of the Senate really began then, because all of a sudden everything was on TV, and there was much more transparency. Every word they said was available to their constituents, and in particular to all of the activist groups and lobbyists and so forth. And so if they made one statement that wasn't in line with what one of these groups wanted, they would get absolutely hammered for it. And that made them extremely cautious, it made them dishonest, and it really ended the possibility. So if you watch C-SPAN, I don't know if anyone does that anymore, because what's the point these days? But in the days when people did watch C-SPAN, you'd see these members of Congress talking to an empty chamber, but they weren't talking to each other. They weren't deliberating. They were basically talking to these activist audiences out in TV land, and that was a direct consequence. In the 1970s, Congress passed a bunch of transparency laws, the Freedom of Information Act, the Government in the Sunshine Act, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA. FACA has had this weird effect. It says that in any group in a multi-member commission like the Securities and Exchange Commission, if any two members of the commission talk to one another, it has to be declared a public meeting. There has to be a public record. You have to allow journalists in, and there has to be kind of balanced representation on both sides. And the result is members of the commission don't have lunch with each other. They don't talk to each other because that's going to trigger FACA with all of these requirements for transparency. And so they literally cannot have informal conversations. So they have to use their staffers to talk to one another. They have to do all this bizarre signaling and the like. And so I could go on with other instances of this, but I think that in this case, excessive transparency has undermined the possibility of real deliberation and of the kind of compromise that used to be much more common on a bipartisan basis in Congress. And I would say the internet, which you've referred to already, has vastly increased this because Twitter, I mean, I like Twitter because it's a really good way of keeping up with things, but it's just another further way of exposing every single statement made by, any given person. It used to be that there's a journalistic norm where the journalist would just report facts and not opinions. That was for the opinion page. But if you go to their Twitter account now, you can see exactly what they think about President Trump or anyone else. And I think that, that's more honest. It's more open. But I'm not sure that it helps the credibility and the authority of, the people in that profession. If you talk about deliberation and social learning, I think you've got a slightly different, I'm sorry, if you move to social learning is basically just deliberation, but on a longer time scale. And so, where you want to have social learning is you have the Great Depression. Why did it happen? How are we going to prevent it? Or the current pandemic, how do you deal with a major global infectious disease pandemic? What are the lessons that you can learn from this? And, in past crises, we've had social learning. It's deliberation on a longer time scale where, people write analyses, they trade facts, they asynchronously debate one another. And we actually were able to have this kind of a discussion after the financial crisis, say in 2008. And I think that there really were some lessons that were incorporated into Dodd-Frank and some of the regulatory changes that happened later. But you saw this very dangerous thing beginning at that point, which was the notion that your cognitive abilities are really directed at marshaling the evidence to justify an outcome that you already believe in. Right? That we have this kind of naive view that the way people think is they take in evidence from the outside world, they analyze it, they use their brain power to figure out, what the truth is, and then they act on that. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, I think really effectively debunks that, and he shows, from a lot of social psychology literature that actually it's the opposite, that people start with the conclusion and then they marshal facts, and their cognitive abilities are used to basically explain away things that get in the way of the conclusions that they want. And since the financial crisis, that's become much harder because of the polarization. And that's one of the things that kind of led me to the pessimistic conclusion that Gideon mentioned that in my article, that our ability even to draw conclusions for why the crisis happened and how we could do better, our ability to actually draw those conclusions is much more in question than it was just in the 10 years since the financial crisis happened. How we get beyond that, well, I think we have to restore, in a way, a certain zone of, the nice word is privacy, the pejorative word is non-transparency, to some of our deliberative processes in order to protect the ability of people actually to do things like take risks, take unorthodox positions, negotiate, compromise, and the like. So let me end it there.
Let me jump in with a question to my fellow panelists, if I can. Frank, my father used to summarize the point you just made to me when he was teaching me Wilson's 14 points. And he said, open covenants, fine. And only a schmuck would think they would be openly arrived at. Open covenants, yes, but openly arrived at, that's a schmuck position, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that was his summary of that point. I got that early on. I guess my question to the two of you be following, and it goes to this. We're talking about social learning. We're talking about deliberation. I have found the last several years extremely intellectually disorienting and therefore extraordinarily exciting as well as horrifying. And I'm curious, you chachamim, you wise men who know everything, have you changed your opinion or become less certain about some significant things over the last few years that you really were shocked by in terms of like changing long-held views? I have a whole lot, and unlike you guys, I at this point have lots more questions, lots more complexes. I can see where new research, I would love to write several books now on all the new things I think I see, because the things that I used to see, I now think are all crap. And I'm curious whether you, Frank, and you, Larry, who write big books telling everybody how the world is and what's going on, do you feel any loss of confidence? Do you have any imposter syndrome now at being the world's greatest expert on everything, given the changes? Or do you say, I got it all right?
Well, in my personal case, I really shifted my politics very considerably in the course of the first decade of the 2000s. It was really the Iraq War that triggered this. And so, I switched over. And then the other thing was the financial crisis, which convinced me that conservative positions on economics were also a crock. And so, that happened to me a while ago. But the stuff that I really now start wondering about, I'm a believer in democracy. I think it's a good system of government normatively, and I support it. But part of my support was based on the idea that in the long run, democratic publics basically, would get things right, that the American people might vote for some buffoon in the short run, but, they would eventually recognize their mistake. So it's you can fool some of the people all the time, and, that sort of thing. But I guess recent years, it's not just the United States, but it's watching democratic elections in many countries have really made me wonder whether that fundamental premise is true, and whether actually, given what we know about social psychology, the outcome of democratic choices isn't better explained, not by different social groups and their preferences, but by the ability to manipulate, by manias, by all sorts of stuff that leads to, really negative outcomes. So that's the part that really, troubles me about my moral commitments.
By the way, I agree with everything you just said. I'm curious quickly on that one, Frank, since you know all the classics well. Does this bring you back to a somewhat more classical perspective about sort of the virtues and vices of democracy as opposed to a more modern perspective?
Well, I'm not sure that I ever left the classical perspective entirely, because it's always seemed to me that, even in a democracy, you need a degree of hierarchy and you need expertise, and not everybody is fully capable of exercising the kind of judgment because they may not have, the requisite background and knowledge and so forth. And so it seemed to me that democracy was always in a way, a kind of government by elites, I mean, that's the kind of Schumpeter view, that in many ways it always was a kind of government by elites with some input from the people, but it was, elites that were largely in charge of that. And I guess recent years have made me think that, that wasn't such a bad system in many ways. But Larry, I don't know, what's your view?
My view is that that is the system that produced the wave of populism that's sweeping the world now and elected Donald Trump as president. People were tired of self-appointed coastal elites running everything and felt looked down upon knowledge elites, which you've acknowledged as well in your own writing. And I think that has produced, it's been one of the factors producing a very severe backlash. But, I would put it a little differently. I have no moral reservation about democracy for the simple reason that Winston Churchill cited. And I'm not talking about Winston Churchill's observation that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. I'm talking about his observation that, democracy is the worst system ever invented, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. And I think the Churchillian proposition still holds in important respects now. If you look at a global level, and in particular, if you focus on certain variables, and one variable would be freedom, there's absolutely no question, it isn't even close, that democracies do a dramatically better job of protecting human rights and civil liberties than authoritarian regimes do. And there's really virtually no authoritarian or non-democratic regime that does on any of the scales we have even a middling job of protecting freedom. Also, if you array the control of corruption against the form of government, democracy versus authoritarian, then you do get a few exceptions like United Arab Emirates and Singapore. But basically, there's an extremely powerful correlation between the control of corruption and the presence of the Schumpeterian mechanisms of being able to throw the bums out that are one of the most important levers or mechanisms of ultimately disciplining elites and controlling corruption. It isn't perfect, and it's getting bad again in a number of democracies, including ours. But ultimately, I think this final popular resort of people being able to throw the bums out will once again be a corrective. There are, I can think of probably not as many instances as maybe Gideon or you were referring to, but I'll give you two that come to my mind where my thinking has changed. One is pretty fundamental, and the other I think is also really important. In our Journal of Democracy about 15 years ago, Adam Przeworski wrote an empirical conclusion to a social science study of the life and death of democracies that sounded a bit extravagant to me at the time, but was quoted all the time since, and was taken as received wisdom until recently. And that is that once democracies reached a certain level of economic development, basically, in particular, advanced industrial democracies like Europe, Canada, the United States, etc., democracy was beyond challenge and could be expected to live forever. And I certainly no longer think that's the case. I think we could have a breakdown of electoral democracy in the United States 4 weeks from now. It's entirely plausible, and I have explained and could easily, plausibly explain how it could happen. And I think our democratic institutions are being tested now, and core democratic norms to a degree that I never imagined would be the case in the United States of democracy. And then more briefly, I really did think in the early days of social media that they would be, on balance, liberation technology, enhancing human freedom rather than, you know, stressing it or depressing it. And I think the balance now is clearly in the negative direction.
I agree. And I actually think the more I think about this, I know it's obvious, but we're social scientists, so it takes a long time to form a collective view. The more I've thought about this, the background noise drowning out everything else seems to be the social media technology change of this century more than anything else that is corrupting a lot of the discourse and driving a lot of the passions and making it harder for individuals to listen to the better angels of their nature and instead fanning the flames of the cognitive and emotional and mental barriers that put us all in the bad way. And I guess, you know, Larry, I just say, I'm curious on one thing. I think in your explanation about why people got better, why people's views changed in your deliberative democracy experiment, it was all about the rational discussion. I wonder now whether the rational discussion is all that important as opposed to the human connection. And if you had gotten them to love each other or get to know each other, or, you know, if they had become friends first, would they have had, would the influence have gone the other way? You said, oh, they actually liked each other better or were more understanding or empathetic after. If you had gotten the empathy part first, would that have flowed in the policy direction? Because I think the biggest challenge that I see going forward is the basic human patterns cognitively that we all now know from neurobiology and everything else, right? That lock us into very bad responses individually and collectively. The fight or flight response, in-group, out-group stuff, all sorts of things like that, in ways that can be very pernicious to the prospects for cooperation. And we also know that those feelings are triggered by insecurity, by fear, and that they are lessened by security and by support. And some of the most interesting experiments are not ones about group identity, but the salience of different group identities and when national or subnational ones dominate. And it's when things go bad, when people are feeling stressed, when people are feeling insecure, that their worst angels come out and they feel most protected. And so to me, there is a connection between, an obvious connection between what you're seeing in the national government and the politics and the country's sort of Ghostbusters type sewage of raw slime of emotions bubbling up and making everything awful. But the implication there is also hopeful, because it is that if you change the valence, if you had leaders who tried to soothe rather than calm, if you had public policies that, if you got to Denmark, in Frank Fukuyama's phrase, if you provided some kind of secure environment in which human potential could be recognized, then that's the kind of environment in which people might be able to lay down their guards, connect to each other, only connect, and begin the kind of deliberation that could lead to the sustenance of democracy and the progress going forward that Frank was talking about. But it has to come in a climate of security rather than insecurity, not of love rather than fear, but at least of openness rather than fear. And the people who therefore stoke the fires of fear are doing great damage to democracy, because that they're cutting at the emotive core that is required for the other stuff to work.
Yeah, well, you're basically giving a very articulate and I think persuasive case for democratic deliberation and for the method of deliberative polling. I will say that while we haven't examined all of the evidence yet and finished doing the analysis that we're doing of the data, I think we're reasonably convinced that we would not have seen anything like the level of opinion change and of course emotional change and effective polarization without this sustained small group interaction that took place. And I have a hypothesis that the change was more dramatic, where the groups were, more mixed, because they were randomly assigned to these small groups, so they weren't all equally mixed. But that where they were mixed, and you really had respectful, fact-based deliberation among diverse others, that's where I think obviously you saw the greatest empathy and the most dramatic change. And empathy isn't only, some suburban housewife from, a wealthy area finding out what it's like to be an insecure, undocumented worker in the United States. It's also maybe lower income people beginning to look at the federal budget in a different way than they had before, because they'd never thought about it from a different perspective. I think the key thing is that the people walked mentally and emotionally over the several days in somebody else's mind, in somebody else's perspective, in someone else's mental reasoning process, and in someone else's life experience. And it did break down polarization and move a number of people at least somewhat.
Larry, I agree entirely. And it's funny how these things can happen, and the perspectives, you don't know, everybody needs to be exposed to different perspectives, because you don't know what a different perspective is and how and why until you got on the other end. I had a wonderful conversation with a friend of a friend the other night. And at the end of it, it was really fascinating. She said this amazing thing. She said, this was a really interesting conversation. I rarely get to speak with cis, straight, white men. And I really, I found this a really interesting conversation to hear your perspective, because I don't get exposed to that. I felt like you must be the only person in the world who doesn't get a whole lot of exposure to cis, straight, white male perspective, but I was delighted to, offer it. It was very funny, that's all.
So
what's our next step now?
We can open it up for some of the Q&A. First, thank you for this rich foundation of erudite and illuminating perspectives and conversation. The first thing that I'll put forward is that in the deliberative democracy program that you described, Larry, you mentioned that there were facilitators, and I wanted to ask for you to say a little bit more about their role. We spoke about empathy. You all called out the importance of formation of the human connection. I wondered if you also had any list of how people might have been given guidance about noticing the dualistic tendency in their own mind, or any other invitation to be resilient around their own inner cacophony of reactions.
I'll just say, as the deliberative polls do, we spent an entire day training the moderators for the 40 small groups. And part of what we did is to train them to play a pretty minimalist and facilitating role. So they were to keep the conversation moving along among a number of issues within each theme, like maybe 7 or 8 issue propositions for immigration or the economy or foreign policy that would hopefully be considered and addressed, some at greater length than others, in an hour and a half, hour and 40-minute session. They laid down neutral ground rules for mutually respectful deliberation and listening, and not having one person dominate a conversation at the beginning. And they just, otherwise were, strongly trained not to offer their own opinion, and just to facilitate mutually respectful listening and dialogue over and over and over, and to keep it on that plane, and to try to gently nudge away from anger, polarization, or personal invective, anything that might be headed in that direction. And the really successful moderators were able to create a kind of shared norm in that, and a group atmosphere, and kind of recede into the background over time. There's another fascinating and deeply moving story about the moderators, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. So if there's time at the end, I'll share it with you.
Larry, couldn't you just send the entire country to couples therapy?
No comment. Yeah, it might help.
Well, picking up on
the entire Republican Party and the entire Democratic Party to couples therapy.
Well, picking up on that since, what we're doing in couples therapy, we're building the ability to see the other and to sustain a bond of communication and respect and holding the space of the whole. So I'm going to bring in some of the language of contemplation, that in contemplation, as you know, it's a process of training your ability to observe your own mind and to be non-judgmental and to be the facilitator in the deliberative democracy process and hold the space for your own complex range of emotions and thoughts, and then to discern what to keep private and what to share openly and be transparent about. And with that understanding of the contemplative process, I'm going to invite all three of you to speak to the fact that in 5 weeks as a nation, we will be entering some circumstance which is likely to require all the skills that have been listed tonight. What would you offer in your own reflection as some guides or invitation to all of us here tonight for our own resilience going into the weeks ahead of us?
Well, I'd say number one, take a deep breath and be patient and don't jump to assumptions. But most of all, I would say we need help. We need the political institutional equivalent of a couples therapist to referee this war that we're at risk of experiencing over the November election results. And I can't say it often enough or strongly enough. We need an independent, balanced, bipartisan, respected commission to monitor an electoral process that is at risk of being besieged with disinformation and misuse of our rules and intimidation and voter suppression, and to encourage good behavior, encourage patience, build faith in the electoral process, and call out bad or unwarranted behavior or rumor. The Congress should have appointed this commission. It's been called upon to do so for months now. For its own reasons, it didn't. There's a nonpartisan civil society organization that I think is in the process of standing up this commission. If it happens that this does materialize, which I hope it will in the next week, I think they will take to heart precisely the principles that Frank was talking about, at least in their own internal deliberations. And, maybe it'll make some difference. It won't have legal standing, but it might have moral standing.
I'm not sure that I can offer any useful advice in the month before the election. I think that the larger structural changes that really need to happen in the United States are things that are going to unfold only over a period of some years, following the election. And it's probably worth drawing back a little bit from the heat of the present moment. I mean, I've never experienced a time as intense in terms of information and conflict and fear surrounding an American election as this one. And I just think it's not a healthy atmosphere in which to think about these longer term issues of how you actually solve the divide. So we'll have to get past November 3rd and hopefully get to January 20th. And at that point, I think you can start that kind of discussion. I just want to go back to make sure that people understand what I was saying. You know, my model is not to go to a kind of authoritarian technocratic government like some people imagine Singapore has. I think that the issue really is getting the right balance between public input and expertise, because you know you don't want the FAA to be run by people who have never flown an airplane, right? Um, and so you know you need that kind of you need that the you know the hierarchy that can provide the background and information, and it just needs to be balanced by public input, because you know the experts really oftentimes don't get things right. For example, I actually think that you know right now we're saying to each other, well, it's the politicians versus the experts, and we should listen to the health experts. You know, if it weren't for Trump, there's actually a core, I mean, that's actually not a terribly helpful perspective, because A, experts actually don't agree with each other about a lot of issues. And if you're actually trying to lead a big, complex country, you cannot make public health the number one, you know, priority that trumps every other priority. You actually need a much more complex decision-making process and so forth. And so, you know, my hope is that we will find a better balance between this kind of public input that will not set the stage for future bouts of populism, and that will be able to incorporate, you know, real knowledge into any kind of, you know, public deliberative process.
Let me pick up on that and where Frank left off. I agree with that. And I certainly agree that, look, in the military, we have civilian control, and we have an entire, one of our friends, Elliot Cohen's written a book called Supreme Command, which argues that the best way for civilians to control professionals in the military is not by delegating everything to the experts, nor by constantly micromanaging and manipulating and ordering the experts around because you know better than they do and you have the power, but by engaging in a critical, deliberative dialogue with them, endlessly pestering them with questions, endlessly demanding results, saying, you're the expert, but being like Lincoln and saying, win the damn war for me and keep going and I'll keep firing you until you do. There is in our system a generalist civilian at the top. Power is not given to a technocratic elite except when it caters to rich people like the Federal Reserve. But basically, you have democratic institutions that are open and penetrable, but we now know they depend on character at the top. Because if the system, as Frank said, you need experts and civilians at the top, and members of those, but the people at the very top have to care about the entire polity that they are leading, and that's the problem now. It's not just a lack of listening to experts, it's a lack of caring about the country and the population at issue. In terms of how to move forward, I certainly don't know how to achieve resilience or serenity. In fact, letting go is probably the best way to that I've been able to deal with it. It's first of all, treating the news like an eclipse, where you have like one of those box cameras where you don't look at it directly, but you see the reflection cast only a little bit of, if you submerge yourself in the toxic sludge of communications and media today, you will go crazy and you will become one of those people who swim in that sludge. So keeping that at bay while recharging your batteries. And then it's going to sound really sappy, but this is, where else if not here to be sappy about this kind of thing, being a nice guy, being a mensch, doing something nice for somebody else, it kind of makes you feel good. And you feel like at least I've done something good for that person, and I can't control the universe and I can't control the country and God knows what's going to happen, but I got through the day and it feels a little nicer. So limit your news intake while waiting for all this and do nice things and you'll feel a little better, and it might help recharge you enough to get from day to day as we all watch this crazy thing unfold.
Thank you all three for responding to that. There's another question about, can a model like Denmark's work at a scale like what we have in the US?
Go ahead, Frank.
It's hard. Yeah, you know, I had a visiting professorship in Denmark for a few years, and it's a very homogeneous country. And now that it's a little bit less homogeneous with a growing Muslim population, it's also becoming less like the old Denmark that we admired, because actually it turns out that there's racial prejudice and, you know, discrimination and all sorts of things there. Um, so yes, I would say that it's much easier to govern well a country of 5 million people that are pretty much all relatives of one another. Um, and it is extremely difficult to govern a country like the United States, just given the incredible diversity of the place, which was, you know, in a way baked in right from the country's founding. It's not impossible, but I do think that it requires, you know, both a combination of, you know, complex institutions and, you know, a pretty savvy leadership in order to make that work. And so the chances of it working at scale, I think, are just lower.
Let me say that I think that's right. But, you know, we do have larger European countries that are doing better than the United States now on climate change or COVID or other areas where scientific and technical expertise makes a difference. And Germany comes to mind, despite all of the problems they're having now, despite the growth and support for the right wing, I think, populist and bigoted party Alternative for Germany. Despite all that, I think there's more respect for science and evidence and expertise in Germany now than in the United States. And as a result, their death rate from COVID-19 is only a fraction of what it is in the United States. It's a much larger fraction than in Norway or New Zealand or something like that, but it's still well below that of the United States. And while I think it's true that experts disagree on many issues, they don't disagree on all issues. And most of the scientific and technical expertise now emphatically agrees that we're in a climate emergency that is being caused primarily by human consumption of fossil fuels. And most of the scientific and technical expertise agrees that people should be wearing masks and engaging in social distancing and doing all the things that the White House steadfastly refused to do, that produced the public health crisis within the White House that we have right now, and that I think has contributed to the needless death of tens of thousands and probably well over 100,000 of the 209,000 Americans that have died so far. So, you know, we need to do a better job of listening, to a diversity of views among experts, but listening to when there is an overwhelming consensus among scientific experts, which there are on some issues.
I'll move now to this question of character. You spoke about, as I recall, the article that Frank wrote for Foreign Affairs in the July-August issue named the qualities of trust, leadership, and effective fundamental systems in the nation as traits of the countries that were at that time identified as managing the pandemic better than others. And so in that list of trust, effective functional systems, and leadership, to focus on trust and leadership, I invite you to speak about how in a democracy, and especially our democracy, but democracies throughout the world, the cultivation of integrity and character can be a goal of how the countries are run.
Well, that used to be actually a conservative observation that character matters, in leadership. And I think we've seen good evidence that that is the case. I think that, one adjective I would add to that list actually is competence, because, again, to look at the case of Germany, it's very interesting that, Germany was suffering from this right-wing AfD party's rise over the last few years. They got about 15% of the vote and, entered into the Bundestag and so forth. But they've done very badly since the epidemic. And actually Angela Merkel, whom a lot of people last year had kind of written off as an old, one of these old centrist leaders that was now being rejected, is actually much more popular than she was in January. And the reason was she's handled the whole epidemic very competently. She spoke to the country like an adult, not kind of making silly, projections or boasting, or but just frankly telling people that they were in for, what caused the disease and how you dealt with it and the sacrifices they'd have to make. And then she was rewarded for that politically. And so it kind of makes you think, why not try competence for a change? Maybe that would be the secret to building trust and actually increasing the authority of our institutions.
It's a good peg off that, Frank. When I was in grad school, we were taught that retrospective voting was really dominant, and politicians did things, and the public was basically rational, and it looked at what was done, and it said, I like this, or I didn't like this, and it responded. Now we say, no, it's all partisan polarization. The reality is what you perceive it as. The great sort has occurred, and everybody basically just sort of sees their own reality, and therefore it doesn't change. They can't both be true, right? Or rather, if you're seeing your own reality, you can't do real retrospective voting because you're just making up what you're seeing. And I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting, I think, going forward is this test of which of these theories, of the temporary insanity of theory of partisan polarization, in which, who you are and what you identified as determines the reality that you see and associate and create for yourself, or the existence of some actual reality beyond us that is intersubjective, that we can all access and ultimately, market in our country. And we're going to see that going forward. And I really don't know. As for the character thing, I'll just say one last thing. I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but I actually I miss the old WASPs, the good WASPs, the establishment. We are living through a second Gilded Age. We can all see that. We have the rich robber barons at the top. We can see that. We have the rising wobblies and the leftist protests and the socially disenfranchised people at the bottom pushing up. But where are the Roosevelts? Where are the Endicott Peabodys? Where is the good guy establishment that says we need to become, in Digby Baltzell's terms, a class, not a caste, that we need to incorporate, speak for the nation? Much of the administrative state that we are now mourning the loss of and the corruption of, as Frank knows, he's written about this in great detail, even in front of it, and so was created by, people like Gifford Pinchot in the Foreign Service and people like all those old Protestant, Reformed dissident Protestant types who basically had a secularized Christian ethics, who wanted to do good things for the world and the country. And our elites don't have that anymore. And so you have, the men in skull and bones go into the Treasury Department just like they did a century ago, except now they're Jewish and the ones kept out of the Ivies are the Asians. So there's been some change within the elite, but you don't have the people of the elite caring about the country the way the old Roosevelt believed, I've come to think, and people cared about him, FDR, and he was crucial to the liberal international order because he did believe. And I'm now really wondering whether this entire project of the liberal international order, as well as some of the domestic American political culture, that whether Sam Huntington was right in it relying on some degree of hangover, WASP decency from a tradition that is rapidly going by the wayside. And what we have left is the meritocratic elites who have no connection to themselves or anybody else, just squabbling out. And I worry that that's now what we're coming into. On that depressing note, I'll kick it back.
A little differently. I think that Huntington was right that the liberal international order heavily depended on having a single decisively powerful liberal democratic country to lead it and defend it and rally an alliance behind it, namely the United States. But I don't long for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite days. I think that the underlying thing you want to see, Gideon, is an elite with a sense of shared purpose that rises above narrow partisan or economic or other group interests. And I think we'll be a stronger country if that is an elite that has at least as many women as men and is ethnically, racially, and every other way much more diverse than it was in the 1950s and beyond, because that plays to our strength as a country that is a mosaic of social pieces. And I think we can attain that, but part of the problem is that we're so polarized, and this does play into what Frank was arguing earlier about the need for some breathing space for elites to make compromises and also to forge bonds with one another outside the glare, the white heat of the cameras and their political and social constituencies. Well, you know, there are a lot of encouraging little things that have been done and are being done that I think have a lot of promise. And one of them is something that someone, I think all three of us know, Mickey Edwards, who former Republican congressman from Oklahoma, who ran the congressional program at the Aspen Institute until fairly recently. He ran something called the Rodell Fellowships that has now, I think for 10, 15, maybe 20 years, brought emerging Republican and Democratic mayors, state legislators, you know, young emerging leaders from both parties and across the spectrum together periodically just to interact with one another, socialize with one another, get to know one another. And I think we really need more of that. There's very little of that that goes on in Capitol Hill now. I don't think any longer it has to be all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, and I know you don't either. But it's that underlying sense of transcending transcending divisions and seeking to serve a higher shared purpose that I think we can achieve again with the right structures.
I agree. So I'll suggest Eleanor Roosevelt rather than Franklin.
Frank, is there anything you want to add here, or I want to give you a moment to speak to these points?
You know, I think that spirit of public service is very important, regardless of the ethnicity and religion of the people that are expressing that. And I do think that there were earlier generations, like Dean Acheson was an undergraduate at Yale at the time that World War I broke out, and virtually his entire Yale class volunteered to serve in the trenches of World War I. And can you imagine a current Yale class deciding to do something like that? So I do think that there was a certain sense, you know, that elites had, that because they were elite, they owed a service back. You know, Gifford Pinchot said that he grew up in a very privileged family. He was a member of Skull and Bones at Yale, and he said, well, I've been paid all my wages in advance, and now the rest of my career, I'm just going to be giving back all the stuff that was given to me, you know, that I didn't really, that I hadn't really earned. And very few people, I think, have that sense of obligation. You know, before this meeting, I was watching the Sammys. I don't know if you know about the Sammys, but um, this is done by the Partnership for Public Service. It's the Samuel J. Hyman Public Service Awards, in which they honor a number of public servants that, for the most part, are completely unknown to anybody. So they're working in the bowels of the U.S. government. You know, one of them was a cybersecurity specialist. One was at the CDC. The main honoree was Anthony Fauci, who everybody's heard of. But what's remarkable about those awards, is the fact that there actually are people that still have that sense of public purpose, and they don't get respect. This is why I love this ceremony, because, you know, finally someone is actually paying attention to what they've spent their whole life dedicated to. So it still does exist, you know, in certain parts of our society, but I just think that, you know, we don't cultivate those kinds of virtues and this kind of public-facing um, attitude on the part of, you know, current generations.
Thank you. You've all highlighted values of service and compassionate action and courage and resilience, a sense of hard-earned wisdom carried forward. I thank you for modeling tonight your capacity for complexity that allows people to be inspired to know that it is possible to sit with these questions, to be collegial and empathic and calm and humorous and courageous, and to dedicate it to the service of the well-being of all of us and to our nation. I want to thank you each individually. Gideon Rose, thank you very much. Professor Larry Diamond, thank you very much. And Professor Frank Fukuyama, and thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was fun discussion.
It was a privilege.
Thank you. Good night.